Welcome to the special lecture on Service Science Research and Innovation today. This lecture is part of the NECTEC International Scientific Advisory Panel 2013 meetings, which organized during the 2 days. We have honored that 3 renowned experts in the field of service science research and innovation have accepted to join our panel this year and agreed to give a special lecture to our distinguished guests today. Firstly, I would like to start by giving an introduction to our first experts who will be our speakers today. The first speaker is Professor Dr. Ian Smiles. He is a professor of technological and social change, Manchester Institute of Innovation Research, Manchester Business School, University of Manchester, the United Kingdom. Professor Ian Smiles was the Director of the Center for Science and Technology Policy Management Research and the founding director of the Center for Research on Innovation Competition, also at the University of Manchester. Much of his work on technological innovation has concerned the new generic technology, especially information technology. He has been particular interest in service industry as a user and source of innovations. He is also an editorial board of R&D Management and International Journal on Service Technology and Management and the Service Industry Journal. His talk today will be on knowledge-intensive business service, distinctive innovation, distinctive roles in innovation systems. May I now invite Professor Ian Miles to give his special lecture today. Professor Ian Miles.
Or if I don't make sense, then tell me, and I will slow down. I may not make better sense, but I would try to be comprehensible. So thank you. I realize I have too many PowerPoints, so some of them I will travel through very fast. I want to talk about knowledge-intensive business services today. It's a particular topic in service science, a particular topic in service innovation studies. The idea of knowledge-intensive business services is really just under 20 years old. The first studies which look at these knowledge-intensive business services date from the middle of the 1990s. So I'll begin by talking about what these services are, then move on to looking at what they do, what their ways of working are, and what their roles are in innovation processes and innovation systems. And it will turn out that that's quite a lot to cover, even though this topic is not a very long established topic. So we're used to thinking about different sorts of service. Some services are very loud, some services are very quiet. So I'm going to focus on one sort of business services right now. There are, of course, many different sorts of service industries supply services to business firms, to business sectors, telecommunication services, financial services. These support businesses, but they also support consumers to a large extent. I'm going to be focusing here particularly on business services that provide the main bulk of their output is provided to other firms or to the public sector. So they may be servicing manufacturing firms, they may be servicing service firms like hotels, for example, they may be servicing public services like health services and the like. And the two main traditional categories of these sorts of business services are, first, the more professional services, and secondly, the more operational services. Professional services, relatively knowledge intensive, operational services, relatively labor intensive. Typically, any one that tells you any rule about services is wrong, because there are always exceptions. That is the only rule about services that is right. There are always exceptions. So we're going to be looking at these particular sorts of business services, and I want to stress the point that they're business services because they support business processes. They support business processes in the public sector as well as the private sector. They also support business processes in third sector organizations, in voluntary organizations, for example. The first attempt to define what these services were was made in 1995. We defined them then as being highly reliant upon professional knowledge. Some of this was scientific and technical knowledge. Some of this was more administrative and operational knowledge. Some of it was more sociological knowledge, knowledge about markets, knowledge about consumers, knowledge about changing economic environments, things of this sort. They produced this knowledge and provided as inputs into business processes of other firms. The inputs can take lots of different forms, and I'll be talking about that later on. But supporting those business processes in that case. And in an update of that discussion and definition a little while ago, we stressed the point that the support was to business processes, not just to business firms. We made efforts to clarify the operational definition of these sectors using the earlier version of the Statistical Industrial Statistics classification, the NACE-1. It's a version we use in Europe. It was relatively straightforward. Thank you. They were sectors 72 to 75. I'll talk about what that is in a few moments, of NACE-1. And there's an issue of, well, what do we mean by knowledge intensity? And I'll produce some statistics illustrative of this in a little while. But one good or one simple knowledge intensity is just the share of people with workforce. In this case, if we just take university degrees, we'll find that in the knowledge-intensive business services firms, the firms in these sectors, 72 to 75, are really outstanding. Only the health service and the education service have higher shares of university graduates in their workforce. These sectors of the economies are ones which have shown rapid growth just about everywhere you care to look. They've shown higher than average growth compared to the rest of the economy. They've shown higher than average growth as compared to other service sectors of the economy. And the European Competitiveness Report 2 years back had a little section looking at KIBS, and it produced these results showing very rapid growth rates across different regions of the world. And this means that these services have come to be a substantial share of the market economy now. They're around 15% in terms of value added and employment in business sector in the European Union, for example. The European Union is pretty big. Some countries that percentage is going to be a lot higher, like in the United Kingdom, for example. So they're actually a rather important sector of the economy. And until the 1990s, we were tending to neglect these sorts of services. A lot of the focus on the growth of the service economy and the nature of services was looking very much at consumer services. Now we're looking much more intensively at these different sorts of business services, which statistically, if this was the original NACE-1, that's almost impossible to read. That's the capture from the screen. So this is my reprocessing of this information to make it a little easier to look at. So these are the fairly detailed classifications. We see here there are some services to businesses which are mainly to do with technologies of one sort or another. Computer services, for example, engineering services. There are some services, and research and development services, of course, very interesting. direct support for innovation processes. And then there are some services which are much more traditional professional services, like law and accountancy services, and some which are maybe more social science related services, like market research services, advertising, opinion polling, things of this sort. You'll see down there at the bottom we find in this NACE 1 classification some of the administrative and operational services slip into this sector 72. So we have a little bit of messiness with the statistics, a little bit of noise in the statistics, and that's almost inevitable. Just very briefly, the new version of NACE, NACE 2, makes a big distinction, big differentiation between the more professional services, what they call professional and scientific business services, and the more administrative and operational business services. If we look to see what they include in the professional and scientific services, we see all of that range of services. I talked about legal services, accountancy services, architecture, engineering, research and development, advertising, market research, polling, design, photography. Wait a minute, what's happened to computer services? Unfortunately, they've moved off computer services and some other information technology services to another sector altogether. So they've improved it in one way. They've differentiated the professional, scientific and technical KIBS from other business services. But computer services has gone off somewhere else. So we still have to play around a lot with the statistics to get any clear information on those. Just for information, here are the services which are the more administrative and operational support services: renting of goods and equipment, employment services, travel services to businesses, security services to businesses, almost everything except one cleaning services. One classic thing that always used to be put together: security, catering and cleaning always used to be grouped together. Now catering has gone off into some other food industry service. Okay, I promise that's the end of the statistical definitions, but it's useful, well, I hope it's useful to have some effort to clarify some of these things before we launch into the details. And this is just a little bit of processing I did of British data to indicate the relative size of these services. I've put in a couple of other business-related services just for comparison, but we'll see up there on the top right, services like legal services and accountancy services and management consultancy account for a very large share of the employment and the value added in KIBS, followed by computer services, for example. Then other services like architecture and engineering come down lower until R&D services, which are considered to be so important that they're given a grouping all of their own and are pulled out in the statistics very often, is actually a relatively small sector, numerically, in terms of employment, in terms of value added. That's not to say that it's strategically not important. So, just some examples of the sorts of firms and sorts of services, just some web pages from different sorts of services. I'm not going to talk about the details of these. I just wanted to give you a concrete flavor of some of these different sorts of activities, like computer service firms, an R&D services firm. This one, very specialized firm. It provides analytic support for the pharmaceutical industry. And related to R&D, but a different category, is testing services, which are also very important when firms are introducing new products. Also very important for testing the quality and compliance to various standards of established products, whose quality may not remain constant over a long period of manufacturing. Services with more of a focus on advertising, on design, on consultancy, on design. Sometimes very technology supported, sometimes very much a face-to-face activity. More consultancy activities, in this case a consultancy firm with a particular interest in marketing, if my memory is right. This is a firm which provides support to people doing advertising and marketing cross-culturally to make sure that their television advertisements, for example, work in different societies, that they're not offensive, that the words mean the right things when they're translated into different languages, that they're complying with the regulations in different countries, things of this. All sorts of specialized knowledge that the business users are not likely to have themselves. We're living in complicated societies with continuously changing technologies, continually changing regulations, continuously changing market conditions. There's a great deal of knowledge that businesses have to have, and it's just too much for most organizations to handle all this knowledge internally. You have to go outside to gain this knowledge. KIBS provides specialist knowledge which can support your business processes, and sometimes with a focus on, particularly on small businesses as your support. Sometimes the KIBS firms themselves are very small firms. Okay, so that's an introduction. We see that these services are very spatially concentrated. They tend to locate around metropolitan areas. They tend to concentrate around the key centres in the societies in which they're based. So this is some data from the European Cluster Observatory, which provides data on different regions of Europe and what clusters of industry are operating. This is a mapping of where KIBS are concentrated across Europe. And I'm not going to say there's cause and effect. I'm not going to say that KIBS are leading to greater levels of innovation or growth or things like that, but they tend to be clustered in those same regions that are the regions where there is greater level of innovation, like patenting, for example, are greater levels of economic growth. Probably it's a virtuous circle. They're drawn there because these are the areas where things are happening and where people have the needs for their services. So, if we have these sorts of specialized business service firms, there are a load of questions we need to ask about them to understand them better, like what sorts of knowledge they're using, how they get this knowledge, how they apply this knowledge, how this knowledge is absorbed by their clients, if it is absorbed by their clients, and what role this has on innovation, and in individual clients and in the innovation systems more generally. But the first thing I'd say is that, of course, there are as many forms of knowledge as there are people, more or less, or certainly many forms of knowledge as there are disciplines that are taught in universities, professional practices that are conducted in business. But perhaps a rough grouping is that we can think of three broad types of knowledge, and most businesses will have some share of each of these types of knowledge. You have to have knowledge of particular technology and techniques, for example, and I put that at the top axis. You have to have knowledge of particular institutional systems you work within, administrative systems, for example, legal and regulatory systems. And you have to have knowledge of human beings, of their cultures, of their psychology, of their experiences. We talk a lot about experience industries these days. And this is really a rough attempt to suggest where different sorts of KIBS may lie. That some of them will specialize very much in the technology, in the technical knowledge, for example, like R&D services, for example, engineering services, computer services. Some of them will be much more focused on helping businesses deal with the administrative and social systems they work within, so legal services, for example, accountancy and auditing services. And some will be much more focused on the cultural contexts that the businesses work within, so such as like advertising and market research, and perhaps some elements of design services as well. We'll have to have a large focus on users and user requirements. Almost any firm is going to have some combination of these different sorts of knowledge. Measuring knowledge is something that's rather difficult, especially since knowledge isn't actually a thing that's out there. I would see knowledge as actually more to do with a practice that people conduct, the way that we use information within our understandings to achieve results. But we could perhaps make a bit of progress on this. I don't have any way of measuring people's knowledge in the cultural and social sphere, but we have data produced in various surveys on university graduates classified into two main groups, into graduates that are working in science, technology and engineering, and graduates that are working in other areas. And our KIBS, our knowledge intensive business services, are all right over here on the right hand side of this graph. This is European level data for around the year 2000, if my memory is right. And we see that this is of the private sector, we see that the KIBS are outstandingly knowledge intensive. This is the share of graduates in your workforce. And the blue bars are the graduates of science, technology, engineering and mathematics. And the purple bar is the graduates in everything else. So that's humanities, that's social science, that's areas like professions, and things of this sort. And what comes out quite clearly here is that we get, well, first, the KIBS are exceptionally knowledge intensive, much more so than, for example, high-tech manufacturing, which is more knowledge intensive than medium-tech manufacturing, which is more knowledge intensive than low-tech manufacturing, so that tends to validate the statistics a little bit. And we get some KIBS fairly clearly that are drawing on this technology-based knowledge, and we get some that are much more drawing upon the other sorts of knowledge. But in all of these sectors, we have a mixture of the different sorts of knowledge being employed. So one of the things, I'm not going to talk very much about this, but one of the things that follows from this is that we're dealing with firms here, KIBS firms, which have high share professionals in their workforce. Sometimes more than 60% of the employment in one of the KIBS industries is graduates. So we have a very unusual workforce. Managing knowledge workers is not necessarily the easiest thing to do. They carry their knowledge. How do you know what knowledge they have? How do you encourage them to, for example, to share their knowledge when that knowledge is the asset that they have, which gives them their position and status in the company, for example? How do you get different knowledge workers to work together? What you often hear managers in these businesses saying is that the trouble is when we shut the door at night, all our assets have gone out of the building. They've all gone off home or to do whatever it is else they're doing in the evenings. So there are big issues that confront these firms. How do you retain these workers, especially as their knowledge is growing through practical application in the company? How do you motivate them to work well? How do you motivate them to work together and to collaborate with other workers, perhaps workers with different sorts of knowledge, coming from different professional background, different discipline, for example? So these are real challenges that firms of this sort confront. And we can see quite a lot of activity going on now in trying to develop knowledge management strategies within KIBS firms to help these firms get a better grip on the knowledge assets that they have within the company, to find ways of motivating and guiding their workforce so that there can be really constructive and productive collaboration within the firm. So I talked about three broad types of knowledge, but I didn't really talk about what this knowledge was of. And it basically can be knowledge about anything which is involved in your business processes. It can be internal issues to the firm, like how you organize your machinery, how you organize your buildings, how you organize your workforce, how you manage things like health and safety and crises within the company, all sorts of things of this nature. Or it can be matters to do with external features of the context the firm is operating in, the markets it's working in, what its competitors are doing, what the natural environment is around the firm, what the regulators are up to, what the finance requirements are, all sorts of things of that nature. We will find specialist KIBS that deal with any one of these topics. And we will often find that the bigger KIBS firms will work across a range of these topics. They'll work on financial performance of the firm. They'll work on what your competitors are doing. They'll work on regulatory compliance. And maybe this will go into areas like health and safety and environmental areas and the like. So there's a lot of very specific things which firms need to have knowledge about. Sometimes firms will buy in services from a KIBS to validate the knowledge they already have internally. In fact, I can give an example of this from my own experience. We were called in, well, I'm not actually a KIBS, I work in the university, but we were called in to provide a knowledge-intensive service. We're called in by a big manufacturer of aero engines to provide intelligence about what technology developments were in the areas outside of their own mission, which might impinge upon them in the future. What were the developments in robotics, what were developments in nanotechnology, and so on and so forth. And we mobilized a series of experts on these areas. We created some processes, some scenario building processes and things like that to provide insight into what the implications would be for this firm in the future. And at the end of the day, the firm said, thank you very much, that's great. 6 out of the 7 things you've said are things which we'd already decided internally through having done this process already internally. 1 of the 7 was something that was new for us, which we're going to have to go away and think about as well. So they had the internal knowledge to a very large extent, but it was important for them to validate it by getting some external sources of knowledge in to provide them with feedback. And that's very often the case when you see things like consultancy services being used by firms. Often that's there to confirm and validate the knowledge that some people in the business already have, but that perhaps they will need some external legitimation to make this knowledge that can be acted upon within the business. Right, so there are different ways in which these sorts of knowledge can be applied, helping to solve problems, to provide solutions for business, but perhaps sometimes going beyond just providing solutions. I often will say that KIBS are in the business of providing solutions. Sometimes KIBS say, no, we're in the business of helping firms spot opportunities, not just solving problems they know they have. Solving problems or finding opportunities they don't even know they have. But anyway, there's a range of different ways you can go about doing this. You can be providing basic information resources, which can be used by the clients to help define what their context is, what sorts of problems they may be confronting, how they might be able to work with these things in the future. They may already have a problem. They're aware that something is going wrong, but they're not really sure what the nature of that problem is. Why are we using so much energy up? How can we get a handle on this? So helping to define what the problem really is, where the energy wastage is taking place, for example. To help them provide solutions. What can you do about this? How can you reorganize yourself? What sorts of technology or new routines do you need to introduce to be able to deal with this problem? Okay, well, this is what you ought to do, but how can this be configured? What sorts of items need to go together? What hardware will go with what software, for example? What organization of your working patterns will be needed to accommodate these new technological systems? Things of this sort. And finally, we will find KIBS firms that actually do the job themselves, that will do the cleaning up of your waste products, for example, for you, that will do the recruitment of the staff that you need to have for you, activities of this sort. So we can see everything from providing background information to actually supplying the solution, implementing the solution going on. And again, different KIBS firms will specialize in different things. Some of the bigger firms may be active across the whole area. So one of the standard ways of looking at KIBS is often as being intermediators. And certainly being intermediation agents is an important role. They will draw upon knowledge that is produced by research and development, by universities, by government laboratories, by other research active organizations. They will use that generic knowledge, they will process it and translate it and provide it into a way that the clients can absorb, can use in their own business processes. And that certainly does happen. But typically the process is rather more complicated than this, because the client also provides knowledge. What is often required is not just translation of knowledge, it's fusion of knowledge.
It's putting together the generic knowledge that the KIBS is a carrier of with the very local knowledge that the client firm has about what its operations are, what its contexts are, what its own view of its opportunities might be, to create some new sort of fused knowledge of what the opportunities are, what solutions might be. So this is actually, and a word I will use again later, this is a co-produced service. The client and the KIBS firm are working together to produce this new knowledge, these new ideas about the ways in which to proceed. So more than just intermediaries, or if they are intermediaries, they're intermediating in all directions. It's a very active process. Well, there are several different ways in which this sort of process can be conceptualized, and this is one of the big challenges for service science, is thinking about the nature of relations between the service provider, so-called, and the service customer or client, so-called, because the client is often very, very active and engaged in the process of producing the service. So there are three ways of looking at this I'd like to mention, and I don't think they're exclusive at all. They're different ways of looking at the same issue. The first thing is the service itself. How far is the service a standardized service or a customized service? How far is it something which the firm can supply to all of its clients? How far is it something that's supplied on quite a unique basis for one particular client facing that particular problem? Then the service relationship between the customer and the client. Is this really like a contractual relationship? We ask you to do something, you do it for us, or is it a much more interactive process? Let's see what this problem is and define it and work on it jointly. And then the process of service production. Well, is it just production? You give us the service, or is it co-production? We'll make the service together. We'll create the value together. Now, all of these are different perspectives, and they're all things which vary. A service can be more or less standardized, customized. The service relationship may be more or less contractual, more or less interactive. The service process may be more or less production, like in traditional industry, or more or less co-production, like a face-to-face service very often is. And these sorts of things are liable to vary over country, over sector, and over time. Often the focus of innovation will be on trying to, for example, make a service more standardized so you can go for economies of scale. Or maybe to make it more customized so you can move up market and charge more for your service. Different strategies are adopted, different sorts of innovation will be followed in pursuit of that. But I was just going to present a few data which give us a bit of an insight into some of these things. So the first is Christian Hipp, German colleague, worked a great deal with the German survey of innovation in German service firms and sectors. This is back to the 1990s. Most of the illustrations I'm going to give from now on, by the way, are based upon studies I've been involved with or studies of close colleagues of my own. And they will span quite a long period of time and come from all sorts of different places. As I say, this is German data, and one of the striking things here is in Germany, many service firms actually said that most of their production was of standardized services, not of customized services. KIBS firms, however, are firms where customized services are much more prevalent than in the other sectors. So perhaps KIBS are some of the services that are most like the stereotype view of services as being highly unstandardized, almost as much of an art as a science in terms of the production of the services. And there are relatively few people that have gone into trying to, beyond case studies, into trying to get a handle on this sort of phenomenon. One Swedish colleague, Joanna Nahelinder, did a survey of around 1,000 KIBS firms in Sweden around the turn of the century. And in her work, she found that KIBS, in this case, reported much higher levels of interaction than you would have anticipated from the German data. In this case, a very large number of KIBS firms, around 80%, said they had extremely high levels of interaction with their clients, that they had high levels of contact with the clients during the course of production of the service. And interesting for the issue of innovation, almost half of them were reporting that they had positive impacts in terms of the client's development of new products or new routines in their businesses. We'll come back to that last sort of point in a little while. I'm currently working a lot with Marina Doroshenko and other people in Russia. As you know, I've been spending quite a bit of time in Russia. And these are some data. She's carried out a series of surveys in Russian KIBS firms. Russia is an interesting location here because KIBS is a fairly new phenomenon in that country. But it's a phenomenon that's very dynamic. We've had the rapid growth of a lot of KIBS since it turned into being a market economy. So the full details here are probably not worth talking about. There's lots of differences of different KIBS subsectors she's looking at. But what we find is we ask how many of the services that you provide to your customers are standardized, are a mixture of standard services and personalized shells of the service. So the core of the service may be standard, but you modify it on surface features mainly to fit particular clients, for example. And how far your services relatively customized services, produced more or less on a unique basis for each client. And we find again, a lot of the services are customized. Even more of the services are typically standard services, but personalized. Quite a lot of work has gone into making them distinctive for each client. And relatively small share, bigger in some sectors, some auditing, for example, than in other sectors, but a relatively small proportion typically is very standardized services. And Marina Doroshenko went ahead to ask, how far are your services then, if you've introduced a new service, how far are you able to use that service with another customer in the future? And rather strikingly here, the biggest group of this is never. She asked you, can you often replicate the same service? Can you do it? Do you do it sometimes, or do you never do it? And we found that never is the biggest category of these. So what we have here is a strange phenomenon. Whether it's a good or bad phenomenon, I'm not going to say. But we have the phenomenon that KIBS are very often producing new services, developing new solutions, but on a one-off basis. That solution isn't then being replicated and used for other customers. Now, maybe that makes sense, maybe it doesn't make sense. Doroshenko also goes on to look at how standardized the service is, and through the process of the service. Instead of taking the service just as one thing, she looks at the different stages in service production and delivery. And the picture she gets is, well, relatively few services are standardized, but the point at which they become standardized tends to be towards the end of the service production process rather than at the beginning. At the beginning, you're working much more interactively with the customer, defining the problem, getting data from the customer, doing new things with the customer. It's only you're standardized maybe with the way you deliver the service to the customer at the very end, perhaps the PowerPoints you produce, or the tax return forms that you produce, or the way you go about integrating the new technology or the new workers into the workforce, and so on. She's one of the people that has also tried to look at not just the issue of standardization, but also the issue of co-production. So she's asked people in her companies, in her KIBS firms, how far their activity is co-produced with the customer of the firm. And she had a rating scale. I think the scale was 1 to 10, and finds on that rating scale that the average is well above the midpoint, that levels of quite high co-production are quite common in the different KIBS firms. Okay, and finally, where co-production takes place. Co-production takes place at different points in the service process, more at the beginning than in the middle, quite high at the end, interestingly. She also asked what is the level of co-production. She asked the KIBS firms, how much co-production do you really need to produce a good service? Typically, firms would say that they needed more than they actually got. So one of the interesting issues here is how you can encourage your clients into really being interactive, really putting their contribution into the service production so that the service can really be of an optimal level for the customer requirements. Right. So that takes us to the question of what the business relationship is. One of the best known approaches to understanding business relationships for different business services is by Pierre Tourdois. He discussed several different sorts of business relationship. The highly interactive one, which he calls sparring, where there's much exchange from both sides, versus the more standard process of jobbing, of doing basically what you're told by the customer. There's some evidence that this varies from country to country. That, for example, mechanical engineering services in the UK tend to be more sparring, whereas those in Germany tend to be more jobbing. Some evidence. I wouldn't say that we have definitive proof of this, because there's been very little effort to develop comparative data on these sorts of topics. We're also getting researchers looking at how that business relationship is managed. And we have work looking at how it's managed on the client side. For example, Faiz Galouja's work on how customers go about procuring services, and some recent work from Satsker and other people in Germany on the procurement of services. I'll come back to that in a second. And then some very interesting work from Lance Bettencourt and colleagues in the United States about the responsibilities that KIBS themselves have for making sure that their customers are playing the proper role in the production of the service. And that may involve the KIBS firms being selective about their customers, just as the customers should be selective about their KIBS firms. And that's a very nice paper in terms of sort of managerial advice to KIBS advisors about that sort of process. The Satsker work, which I mentioned before, looked at the procurement of knowledge-intensive services. I'm not aware of other people that have really studied this in the level of detail which they had done. I'm not going to present all of their results. They discuss things in terms of a whole series of strategic imperatives if you're buying KIBS, if you're purchasing in KIBS. But one of the important parts of context for this is that the information asymmetries are particularly high. It's much harder for customers to know what they're going to get when you're buying a knowledge-intensive service than it is for you to know what you're going to get when you're procuring goods or procuring more operational services. So information asymmetries is the economist term for this sort of thing. You just don't know in advance what you're going to be getting. That makes it quite challenging. KIBS firms, of course, will try to develop strategies to reassure their clients about the quality of what they're getting, maybe by quality certification, maybe by having testimonials from other clients, a whole series of methods of this sort, for example. So I'm going to skip that because I'm already running out of time. That was Satsker's issues you have to confront in dealing with asymmetry. In the Russian work, it's very interesting. Here's an economy where KIBS are quite a new phenomenon. So we can see firms that are relatively more experienced in the use of KIBS and compare them with firms for whom use of KIBS is a very new phenomenon. And the interesting thing we see here is that the firms that are more experienced have got a greater understanding, or rather their understanding of the KIBS process is closer to that of the KIBS firms themselves. So clients that are experienced tend to have a better understanding of the need for co-production. They have a better understanding of the fact that they're not receiving a standardized service which they can just order and sit back and get. That they need to make a positive effort themselves if they're ready to get the service that they require. Whereas people that haven't had experience with the KIBS firms are much less likely to understand that. And problems are much more likely to develop for them in the course of their service acquisition. Yeah. The Russian case gave us a very good opportunity to look at this issue. It would have been much harder to look at in a country like Britain, where we're very used to using these sorts of services. So finally now, and I'm running short of time, so I'm going to talk very, very quickly about what is meant to be my main theme, KIBS and innovation. First, I'm going to completely not discuss KIBS as innovators themselves. The only thing to say is we have innovation surveys. We have statistics on the number of firms that report introducing innovations in the last 3 years. Are they goods innovations? Are they service innovations? Are they process innovations? We have evidence on their expenditure on different sorts of innovation-related activity. KIBS appear as high innovators, especially the more technology-based KIBS like computer and engineering services are outstandingly high innovators. They're up there with high-tech manufacturing, sometimes above high-tech manufacturing. Professional KIBS, relatively less so, still higher than well higher than the economy average in terms of levels of innovation. I just focus now in the last few minutes about how KIBS can support innovation in their clients. So again, a scatter of different studies. This was a study we did of environmental services in the UK. How often do you help your clients choose technologies? How often do you help your clients develop technologies? How often do you develop technologies for your clients? We found that large shares of the firms are active in one or more of these activities. These are firms working in the environmental services sector, and that would include firms whose activities might be thought to be relatively more operational activities, waste disposal, for example. The German survey by HIP, she asked the service firms how far they had their activities had impacted their clients and in what ways. Well, a lot of the firms believed that they had impacted their clients positively, increased their client productivity, increased their client performance. This was particularly true for the firms that thought they were providing more customized and specialized services, much less so for the firms that were producing standardized services. So we'll find a sector like software where there was a very high level of customization or specialization. 4/5 of those firms believed that they were making very positive impacts upon their clients. Well, of course, that's the firms themselves. The KIBS firms themselves. You would expect them to think they were doing a good job and to tell you that they were doing a good job, wouldn't you? It would be good if we have more evidence from the clients. We don't in the Russian survey. We do in the German survey. We do in the Russian survey. And surprisingly, we find very high levels of clients believe that they've become more knowledgeable. They've become wiser in business through working together with the KIBS firms. In fact, typically, the clients tend to report this effect as greater than the KIBS firms themselves do. And we find that again with the Russian data, that the firms that report the interaction with KIBS, an outstanding proportion of them regard that the interaction is positive on their innovativeness. Hardly anyone thinks that it's been negative on their innovativeness. I think legal services is one case where maybe we have not been able to innovate because we've been told things by the lawyers that have decided to make us stop doing that. But even that is very uncommon. Many of these KIBS are reported by their customers as having high impacts upon the customer innovativeness. I've taken out another slide which was going to go into a bit more detail on the sorts of innovation, but we have data on where the impacts are the impacts upon your markets you reach, are they upon communication processes, upon information technology and the like. Just moving to some British data, in this case a study I haven't been involved with, it's just a study conducted by a consultancy on behalf of consultancies, demonstrating that actually quite a lot of customers were not satisfied with the services they got from their KIBS. Around 15% were not at all satisfied. Most of them were satisfied. Just over a third were completely satisfied. Perhaps this goes back to this information asymmetry issue, not being quite sure what you're going to get. But when you ask about what sorts of benefits people believe that they've achieved, if they think they have achieved benefits, then we'll see that the benefits are often related to innovation consequences, like reducing our costs of activities, for example, leading us to have more efficient processes within our business, for example, improving our customer services, things of this sort. So while we don't have really consistent evidence on customers' views of benefits, in general the evidence tends to support what people have been claiming on the basis of statistical analyses of users of KIBS, that those statistical analyses of economic performance tend to suggest that people that use KIBS, regions which use KIBS more, sectors that use KIBS more, tend to have better performance. I don't trust those statistics. I would rather see what the users themselves actually believe. So how can this happen? How can this impact upon innovation happen? Well, we've got knowledge flowing into the firm. In principle, knowledge can be used for innovation of all sorts. So the knowledge may help you understand your problem better, perhaps even to understand future problems better, to help reduce your risk in defining your solutions, to help you learn about ways of confronting this sort of problems, about developing new products, new processes to deal with these sorts of problems. And going back to that idea of the service as a process that extends over time, we can see as a process of exchange between the KIBS firm and the client firm. And in this course of exchange, we may have different sorts of knowledge being built up on the part of the client firm, and those different sorts of knowledge can all feed into the innovation that the client firm may undertake. Now, just sometimes, the knowledge may be telling you not to undertake this innovation. You don't want people telling you to undertake unsuccessful innovations, innovations that are not going to work, innovations where you can't capture the value, perhaps, innovations where you're going to run up with legal or regulatory obstacles, or where customers are going to be doing things with your innovation that you don't want them to be doing. So sometimes, in fact, deterring innovation may be a good thing. What we want to do is enhance successful innovation, not enhance the level of all innovation, successful or unsuccessful. The idea here is that this process of interaction, which I'm depicting here as a helix, is one where there can be all sorts of learning that can be supportive for the innovation process. And the implications for innovation here then are pretty wide. Of course, using KIBS may, in any case, increase your flexibility, meaning you're not having to invest internally in resources, which can make you rigid. But you can get access to more specialist knowledge through using KIBS, through these people that have really worked with the generic knowledge, that are typically employing graduates who are newly skilled in those sorts of knowledge, and bringing it together with the knowledge of your firm. They're experts in their area of knowledge and in extracting the relevant knowledge from you, which they can combine together with it. This is this fusion. And sometimes the KIBS firms will actually be doing research and development and generating new knowledge on their own side. And again, this is particularly strong for the more technology-related KIBS. There may also be benefits in that they don't have the sort of path dependency of their clients. They're not necessarily wedded to the heritage of their clients, the way that we always do it, the inventions that we've made. They may be more open to other sorts of knowledge. We saw that 14% of customers in the UK weren't satisfied with the services they got. Well, maybe sometimes that's because the customers are not good customers. They asked for the wrong service. They didn't put in the interactive effort in co-production that they should have done. But maybe sometimes it's because the KIBS themselves are not providing the best service too. And when you talk to KIBS and when you talk to their customers, it is clear that sometimes KIBS will be selling services that reflect their own heritage, their own path dependency. They will be wedded towards particular sorts of technical solutions. And you can even see in some KIBS subsectors big divides happening. So in the areas like environmental remediation and waste management, in Europe there's something of a divide between those customers, those KIBS firms, whose job is basically just cleaning up behind people that are making a mess, and those KIBS firms that are trying to advise customers about how not to make the mess in the first place. So if we're thinking about sustainability, we may need to think about what sort of KIBS should we be supporting in this effort. Okay, well, a final point then. When people talk about innovation systems, one of the popular ways of thinking about innovation systems is of a triple helix. Relations between universities and other basic knowledge producers, firms as exploiters and commercializers of knowledge, and government as setting the framework conditions, right regulatory and other infrastructures. What I'm arguing here is that we should think of KIBS as a fourth strand. We'll have to have a quadruple helix. Maybe it's going to be even worse than that, quintuple or something like that. But KIBS represent a new knowledge infrastructure that's growing rapidly and emerging alongside the established knowledge infrastructures, and that's involved in the production and use of knowledge in new sorts of ways. Not just the traditional sorts of research and development that were established through innovation studies for a long period of time, that are the usual elements of innovation policy. Getting a handle on what KIBS are and how they operate is one of the big challenges for service science and service innovation work in coming years, in my view. So just to conclude, a series of issues that rise here. They're issues we need to focus on about the KIBS firms themselves and their activities. They're issues we need to focus on about the client firms and their absorption capacities and their activities in the production of services, for example. There will also be questions which I haven't even pointed to here, but I think we may hear about a little later this afternoon, which is about the orchestration of multiple firms and multiple actors in complex service systems, which are very often what we're confronting when we're developing solutions to big social problems, like health-related problems, like transport and infrastructure problems, and of course sustainability, climate change and related sorts of things. There are a lot of open questions here where we need much better understanding of what the processes are, how these things actually take place, which I've been talking about. For very many of these things, it's quite remarkable how few efforts there have been to develop relevant metrics to assess just what is happening and what the trends are in what is happening. So any efforts we can see towards research in these topics would be very, very welcome indeed. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for bearing with me. And anyone that has any solutions to the problems I've identified will win a prize. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ian Smile, for very intensive information and data on knowledge-intensive business service. Now, any questions from the floor to our experts?
Hi. I've got a spare microphone.
Supporters or advocates of KIBS, and they are doing some tangible work that we can learn from.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, KIBS firms will often have their own professional associations. Sometimes it will be association of the particular types of worker, the professional discipline. So if you look at computer society, the British Computer Society, for example, that will be computer professionals, not computer firms. But there will be another association which will support the computer services industries, Intellect. Intellect is the name of that association. And they have special interest groups. They produce reports, for example, about skills, training and management issues. In fact, they've been one of the groups that has been very proactive in terms of trying to identify skill requirements, to create taxonomies
of the emerging professions and occupations in this area, and the skill requirements and the origins of those skills in that area. And we see this sort of thing in quite a lot of the technology services industries. There's associations of research and technology organizations, for example, which will cover many of the R&D KIBS and engineering KIBS that I mentioned. Across Europe, there's IATO, I think is the association in Europe, for example, of that sort. I'm having a bit of hesitation because there's a British organisation as well, which I think is called AERTO, but the same sort of beast. Then we will often find a professional association where, as you get into the KIBS that are more dealing with creative knowledge, often we will find firms in sort of graphics or in advertising or in design working together in industry associations. This is one way in which the firms can try to reassure their clients that they are operating at a high professional standard by being members of the associations, by perhaps presenting at conferences, by receiving awards. It's very common to have competitions, for example, in the design field, in the architecture field, areas like this. High prestige goes to the firms that can win these competitions, for example. Incidentally, one of the techniques for retention of staff in many of these professional service organizations is it's a dangerous technique, but it's to allow your staff to establish themselves as prominent creative individuals or prominent highly skilled professional individuals by making their own presentations at conferences and workshops and things of this sort. It's individually motivating and rewarding. It's a way of establishing the firm as an active agent at the frontiers of this work, for example. In a lot of the traditional professional services, like legal services, accountancy and things like that, there are well-established professional associations, typically of the individuals. And these are very important as sources of innovation into the professional professional services. Professional services tend not to do research and development, or at least they don't think they're doing research and development. But their professional associations will do a lot of benchmarking, a lot of best practice, a lot of training, a lot of work on new techniques that you can be using. For example, there was a wave in the 1980s and 90s of the new software that can be used in accountancy services, for example. And these organizations played a very large role in that sort of activity. All of these organizations can be very important in mediating between the KIBS and government, trying to provide feedback on regulations, how regulatory infrastructures are working, because we often have regulations in these areas because of this information asymmetry, to try to make sure that customers are not getting ripped off by the service suppliers. They can provide information about standards, try to encourage the public sector as a procurer or the public sector as a standard setter in other ways to adopt particular standards, to encourage industry to follow these sorts of standards, for example. And the standards may well apply to the activities of these firms. And the firms will often also be deliverers of the standards. So training services, training people in meeting ISO this and ISO that is another sort of activity that can be undertaken. What we don't see that I'm immediately aware of is much relation between the KIBS industries and the public research base, between KIBS and universities, for example. Except sometimes we might be in competition with each other. But relatively few university courses are very well geared to the requirements of KIBS. Even to the extent that some legal services is probably an exception, but accountancy services, I've several times heard managers of accountancy firms saying, we don't want students that have studied accountancy. They've come in with critical accountancy theory. We want people that just show that they're clever, hard-working people, and we will train them in accountancy, and we will get them certified by the accounting associations, for example. So a few years ago, one of the studies we did was looking at the relationship between knowledge-intensive services and what we call the science base, that's universities and government laboratories. And we found that with one exception, their relationships were relatively low. And the one exception was research and development services. And they have a high level, this is in the UK, they have a high level of collaboration with universities, much higher level than industry in general. Otherwise, knowledge-intensive services and service industries in general tend to make much less use of the science base than do manufacturing firms. What's going on here? Well, maybe they just don't need it, or maybe our innovation system is a bit wrong. And we've established a science base that is geared in the UK towards industrial sectors that have diminished considerably in the UK. We have a science base that's much more geared towards manufacturing than towards the new service economy which we're living in. It's rather hard to start new university departments and to start new university courses and to establish what the right sort of training is for these areas. But I think this is a big challenge for the future. Just one last word. We're finding quite a lot of these KIBS areas, people in the firms are also quite skeptical of university and public education. And I'll give you one example. Business continuity services, extremely important. Computer disaster recovery, backup services, all these sorts of things. Very, very vital. There's one place in Britain which is the size of a university with big barbed wire fences all around it and lots of big computers and many, many servers, and they're running the backup services for all of the big corporations in the country. So one terrorist attack there would be pretty difficult to handle, I suspect. If you talk to people in these KIBS, they say, well, look, why should we go to universities for support? We have 50 full-time staff working on computer security. You go to a university computer department, you find one person who spends half of their time working on computer security. Who's got what to learn from who? So maybe universities should be actually importing the KIBS to do some of their teaching sometimes. Oh, sorry, that was too long an answer.
Any more questions? So if no more questions to the from the author.
You mentioned about you mentioned that KIBS is all about resource freeing up of resource. Does that mean downsizing as well? Could you give us a practical example of freeing up resource but not downsizing?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks. You may free up a resource that you haven't yet spent. If you have if circumstances have changed and you need some new sort of knowledge, which you haven't got in-house, acquiring that new knowledge is not a matter of downsizing. It's just a question of, do we need to develop a new division of people that are able to, for example, run web services for us? We're having to move into e-commerce, so do we need to set up a new department and employ 20 people to run a website, to set up transactions, processing, all of those things? Or do we contract this out to a specialized service firm? That's a very concrete example. And all the time, firms are confronting new challenges. So sometimes you would turn to a KIBS, you will outsource something, yes. That certainly happens. But I don't think that is actually the primary driver. To a much greater extent, the issue is that there are new challenges being confronted all the time, and you just don't have internal resources for it. Of course, the other question when I mention outsourcing is offshoring, which comes to bear, because not all of these services, but some of these services can be provided remotely. Perhaps the highly customized services are harder to provide remotely, but even so, when we're dealing with information technology-related services, often that can be the case. We know that the London Underground software was written in Bangalore, for example. It was very interactive, but it was done thousands of miles away.
Any more questions? No more questions. Then thank you very much, Professor Ian Smiles, for a very, very intensive and knowledge lecture today.